how we prevent suicide in the Black community. We're going to be talking about suicide prevention today. So, trigger warning, we will be talking about suicide prevention. And I also want to just make a few announcements before I get started that if you or anyone else is experiencing thoughts of suicide, I will put information on the screen about what you need to do. So, please go to the nearest emergency room. You can call 911 and let them know it's a mental health emergency. You can also contact the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, which is open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, by dialing, so texting or calling 988. I will continue to put this information on the screen because it's a very serious issue. So I wanted to just kind of ground us today in the conversation and why I'm talking about this today. So September is Suicide Prevention Month. So we are here as Black women talking about the work that we do to support suicide prevention. And many of us have heard about, issues of suicide, particularly following the very tragic death of Dr. Antoinette Bonnie Candia-Bailey. And so in some ways, it relates to the topics that I normally talk about in relation to Black women and toxic jobs. But this is a broader issue for us to really understand and have more awareness about as the Black community, because you will hear how the rates within our community are actually increasing at a rate that we've never seen before. So that's why we're having this conversation. I also wanted to say that because we're talking about suicide prevention, this can be very difficult for people to hear, particularly if you know of someone who has either attempted suicide or died by suicide. So I just want to just say, give yourself some grace. If you recognize that you're having difficulties listening to this conversation, please engage in deep breathing. If you take a step away, that's fine. And I just want to dedicate this live to how many people we've lost to suicide, particularly in the Black community. And I want to specifically talk about my father, whom I lost when I was 17 due to suicide. So this is my dad here. And this really has motivated me to talk a lot about suicide prevention, and actually why I even became a psychologist, to really understand some of his challenges and his ultimate decision to take his own life. So again, I'm here in honor of my father and so many other people that we've lost to suicide in the Black community. So thank you so much for tuning in today for this very important, sensitive conversation. So if you don't know me already, I'm Dr. Kamani. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist, a toxic job survivor, but more importantly, I'm a toxic job liberator for Black women. And I'm here today with three powerful Black women who are really making inroads and really trying to make a change to address suicide issues within the Black community. So I'm going to have my panel introduce themselves. And again, I will have information throughout this conversation about what you can do if you are experiencing suicidal thoughts, right? So here I have the Suicide Prevention Lifeline number again, that is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week by calling or dialing, texting, calling 988, okay? So I'm gonna turn it over to my panel. And I have two of my Spelman sisters with me today. And Kimberly, I actually just met through LinkedIn. So it's so exciting to know that we're able to make connections remotely. We may have never met each other, but we can still collaborate about some very important work. So I want to turn it over to my two Spelman sisters to initially introduce themselves, and then we're going to go to Kimberly, and then we're going to go into the discussion. So Camesha, if you could introduce yourself, please.
Hi, good evening, everyone. I am Camesha Jones Brandon. I am a licensed clinical social worker, and I am the founder and executive director of Sister Afia Community Care. And we're located in Chicago and provide free community mental health care to Black women and girls in Chicago. And how I came through this work was just really my own personal experience, but also the experiences of so many Black women who were struggling, with mental health and really seeking of support and care. And so throughout my work and really the past couple of years have seen how many Black women are really being impacted by suicide, and kind of what my organization is willing to do to make sure that we don't lose, anyone that we come into contact with, but provide them with care that's grounded in compassion, but also like research and best practices.
Thank you, Camesha. And now I'm going to turn over to Tandra, who is actually not only my Spelman sister, but my classmate. So Tandra, if you could introduce yourself, please.
Thank you, Kamani. As you mentioned, my name is Tandra Rutledge, and I am a mental health consultant and suicide prevention strategist. I'm also the director of youth and campus programs for Soul Shop, which is a faith-based organization committed to equipping faith leaders with the tools and resources that they need to address suicidal desperation within their congregants. I also sit on the Suicide Prevention Task Force for the state of Illinois. And true disclosure, I am the board president for Sister Afia Community Care.
Awesome. Thank you, Tandra. And Kimberly, welcome. If you can introduce yourself, please.
Good evening, and thank you for having me. So I'm Kimberly Franco Gilbert. As of about 2 months ago, I'm now Miss Gilbert. I got to get used to saying that, so you might see Kimberly. If I
Congratulations.
say Franco, forgive me. Thank you. So I am a military veteran of 23 years. At my 22nd year of service, I lost my brother to suicide. That's what put me into this work. So I worked for the past 12 years as the suicide prevention program manager for the Army Reserve. Learned quite a bit of information there, and I saw a lot of gaps. So actually, about 1 month ago, I decided to step away from that work to fill in those gaps that we see, and that's helping our family members and really doing a good job of being as a support for people who have had loss. That we don't do a good job of taking care of those in their grief journey, and that's my passion. So that's what I do.
Wow. Thank you, Kimberly. And I'm sorry for your loss as well. And I appreciate everyone here, and even those of you who are in the chat watching, that you're taking the time to really listen to this conversation, even though it might be difficult to hear. And when we think about issues of mental health struggles, suicide, it can be so difficult. And particularly if you've lost someone to suicide, there's a degree sometimes of shame. And so I hope that we are modeling for you that if that has been your experience of losing someone, that it's nothing to be shameful, you're shamed about. This is something that has happened, and we need to be able as a community to talk about these very difficult issues in the hopes that we can prevent other people from choosing to take their lives. So ladies, we're going to start with the conversation. If you think about, mental health and mental health awareness and mental health treatment, and suicide, there's so much stigma in our communities about these topics. Can you share your thoughts about why there's such stigma about these issues?
I can start with a response. I think that the stigma in the Black community, it has decreased over time. I've never seen more people than ever talk about therapy, talk about mental health, even considering it. However, one of the things that I often find is the stigma around weakness or minimizing our struggles or our pain can really prevent people from seeking treatment. So one of the statistics is that, women, Black women have higher rates of depression, but they're less likely to seek support, right? And so there are so many different reasons for that, such as, not wanting to appear weak, or believing that you can take care of what you're experiencing right now, even though it may be something that needs more support. So I've just seen a lot in my work of that, the stigma around it's not really that bad, or, I don't want to be seen as weak, or people, mischaracterizing me because I have, a particular mental health condition can really prevent people from wanting to step forward and seek care sooner, because the sooner you receive treatment, the faster you are able to recover. But in the Black community, the longer we've gone without treatment, our mental health symptoms and severity gets worse, and it takes us longer to recover. And that is what I've really seen a lot in my work.
And Tandra, I saw the really excellent interview you had on a news show, and you were talking about some of the stigmas that Black people have about accessing treatment, and how sometimes even in the church, the message has been, pray it away or give it to God. And there was a conversation about, can you go to therapy and still be, a Christian or believe in your faith? Can you talk a little bit about that?
I can. And I actually almost wore my "You Can Have Jesus in Therapy" t-shirt for this, but I didn't think people would be able to see it on the live. We hear a lot in the Black community and particularly in the Black church, that there is a denial of mental health issues, and that the belief that all you have to do is pray it away. And that's not true. Mental illnesses are real. People struggle, and that's real. And in the work that I do, I help faith leaders to learn how important it is to incorporate suicide prevention in their ministry. A lot of the stigma that we have, if we think back historically, going even back to chattel slavery, there were negative consequences for Black people showing emotions, and the role that psychiatry has played in race-based illnesses and diagnosis and treatment, can't be understated. And so that is a part of our history that we need to verbalize, and we need to address in helping us to address the stigma. As Camesha said, it's much better now than it was, and we still have a way to go to undo the harmful impact of stigma in the Black community.
Yes. So prayer and therapy.
Yes.
You have to choose one or the other. It's so important. And you also said something else was really good in that interview. You talked about mental health is important for all of us. So mental health is on a continuum. Many times we think about mental health, we automatically think mental illness, but it's a continuum. So can you speak to why is mental health important for all of us, and how is mental health on a continuum?
Well, I'll just give a really definition of when we're talking about mental health. And when I do workshops, I talk about mental health and physical health. And mental health has to do with our thoughts, our feelings, and our behaviors. It involves how we cope with problems, how we relate to one another. And everyone has it. Mental health is not good or bad. It's not a negative thing. And just like we care for our physical health, and we should prioritize our physical health, we have to prioritize our mental health and well-being. And so there are some days that are harder than others, that we struggle, that we're extra tired, maybe we're a little anxious, and that's okay. It's about how we cope with those feelings, those thoughts that we're experiencing is important. So understanding that mental health is not a bad word, it's not a dirty word. It's something that everyone has, and it's on a continuum.
Yeah, right. So it's like from mental wellness to mental health challenges to mental illness to profound chronic mental illness. So you're right, it's that continuum. So let's shift and talk a little bit about particularly suicide prevention. So I remember growing up, I used to hear so much that that's not something that we do. We don't do that, right? And so when my father passed, that was even more of the devastation. Was the message that I was told was that we don't do those kind of things, and because of that, there's so much shame that that's what happened to my dad. And so, can we speak a little bit about that false, belief that it's not something that happens in our community, because it does? So can we talk a little bit about that? What is the data that's currently out that talks about the rate of Black suicide, particularly Black youth suicide? Because there's been a lot of, I would say, last few years, a lot of publicity about the increasing rates of Black youth suicide that I think many of us are not even aware of, but the rates are surpassing and really increasing at a rate that we've never seen before. So can you all speak to the data? What is the data saying about suicide in the Black community, particularly Black youth suicide?
Kamani, I'd like to, I'll cover that. I kind of backs with what the last lady was speaking of. What's your name again? Sorry.
Tandra?
Tandra, yeah. What Tandra was speaking about the church. So with my my loss, I lost my brother to suicide. My mother and father are both ministers. So when
Wow.
we talk about this doesn't happen to us, and I was in the military for, like I said, 22 years at the time I lost my brother. So I had training on suicide prevention, but my focus was on who the demographic looks like. And if you look at
Mm-hmm.
statistics, it's a Caucasian male between the ages of 18 and 23. That's not my
Mm-hmm.
brother. So I
Mm-hmm.
couldn't look at him in the same way that I would look at maybe a soldier, even a stranger on the street, because in my
Mm-hmm.
eyes, I'm thinking he's an African American male. We are from a Christian background. We pray a
Mm-hmm.
whole lot, and that could never happen to us.
Wow.
So when it happened to me, my goal is to make sure that people understand, hey, it could be any one of the four people on this call right now,
Mm-hmm.
or people that look just like us, because we
Mm-hmm.
carry that burden, and often we have that the stigma that perpetuates is that um, you got to pray it away, and we
Yeah.
know that we need to have prayer, yes, but also couple that with therapy and couple that
True.
with talking to your doctors. But we've continued to see that, and part of it is just in the way that we speak, like our messaging. One of the things that I'll say, two words that really bothered me when I after I lost my brother. First one
Mm-hmm.
was the word commit, because in the church
Yes.
I always heard committed adultery, committed a sin. So
Mm-hmm.
when I just even the word commit would kind of make my heart beat a little bit more,
Mm-hmm.
and just that
Mm-hmm.
physiological feeling from hearing the word commit, to
Mm-hmm.
the point where I had to adjust how I felt. And I said, okay, I like that word commit only in one way. And that's to say, I'm committed to stopping suicide. I'm committed to educating people on suicide, just so that it wouldn't make me have that feeling.
Yeah.
And then the other word is triggering. So for me, even just saying the word, hey, these are triggering events. I lost
Mm-hmm.
my brother to gun violence, to a
Mm-hmm.
gun suicide by weapon, which we know that's the highest rate. People use weapons as the highest method for suicide. So
Mm-hmm.
even hearing that word triggering and suicide, or triggering and commit together, really brought me down, physically,
Mm-hmm.
mentally, emotionally, spiritually. I could feel it. So
Mm-hmm.
I had to change that, and the people around me to say, hey, let's find a different word. Let's use a different different language when we speak,
Yeah.
because it definitely it can have an impact on you emotionally. But looking at the statistics, we see that a lot of people don't really track the stats on suicides, but we do know that the younger African American generation have the highest rate that's increasing right now. And
Mm-hmm.
people also don't look at the elderly. A lot of the
Mm-hmm.
elderly numbers are going up, and we don't look at them so much. I think because people are like, well, they're older. They're kind
Mm-hmm.
of like closer to that time, anyways. But their numbers are increasing too. But it's
Mm-hmm.
important for us to have this conversation and get to where we're talking to our youth now, to say, hey, it's okay to see a therapist. My T-shirt says
Yeah.
it's okay that you're not okay. And I
Yeah.
typically will put on a T-shirt and just walk around, and people like, I like that. I like that. I'm like, well, let's talk about it, because we have to
Mm-hmm.
just normalize that conversation. We don't do that
Mm-hmm.
enough, I think, in the Black households, because of where we came from. It's typically religious background, and we don't speak about it.
Yeah. And I want to speak to a couple of things. I want to go to Tandra to ask her a follow-up question. So I think a lot of times for us in the Black community that we've been taught that we always present like we're okay because we don't want to seem weak, particularly not as a Black woman. So you always present that you're good, you're wearing the mask. So you could be saying you're fine, but you're dying inside. And so when is it okay for us as Black women to recognize there's a time that we need to wear the mask because everybody don't need to know how we feel and stuff, right? And some people might be out to get us, but there's other spaces where we need to be able to find where we can go, therapy, good friends, family, the church, where we can go to really take the mask off and really express how we're really feeling. Because when you have all of that you're holding in within, it could be very overwhelming. The other thing I want to say, Kimberly, was I really appreciate how you brought in the conversation about wording, language, and commit. So when I do trainings about suicide, I never say committed suicide because it has that connotation. I say died by suicide. So people who are watching today, be mindful of the language that you use when you talk about someone dying by suicide, not committing suicide. It has a very different connotation. Tandra, can you speak a little bit more also about Black youth suicide? As I mentioned before, I do a lot of trainings on it, and I talk about how the rates have just gone up so at such a fast rate that we're seeing the rates of Black youth suicide increasing and the rates of white youth kind of actually going down in certain age groups. So can you talk a little bit more about that? Because I know you also do that training as well.
Yes, I will. As Kimberly pointed out, the rates of Black youth suicide have increased significantly as compared to their white peers. In fact, Black boys ages 0 to 19 have a suicide rate 2.3 times higher than Black girls of the same age group. There's been some research done that looked at 13-year period between 2007 and 2020 that showed that the suicide rate among Black youth ages 10 to 17 increased by 144%. Nationally, Black youth suicide has been identified as a crisis. We're at a public health crisis. And in fact, the Congressional Black Caucus issued a report in, I might get 2018, their initial report, ringing the alarm on Black youth suicide. There was a follow-up to that report that came out last summer, and it's called Still Ringing the Alarm, that we have to address this epidemic of Black youth suicide. And so it's a call to action for us across the country to really understand the unique factors that impact Black youth, to understand them, to elevate the existing research and Black researchers who have been doing work in this area already, and to develop interventions that are culturally relevant and that take into account the unique needs of Black youth. And so this is very important work. And I'm currently working with some amazing people in the state of Illinois. We're beginning that work to look at ways we can bring awareness to the problem in Illinois and how we begin to address that epidemic across the state.
Yes, thank you for that. And I think when we hear about Black youth suicide, it really scares us because many of us are parents or we know of young people, and it's very concerning, particularly because a lot of us haven't heard about this before. So this is kind of new information. And so I think maybe people watching may be wondering, why are the rates increasing for Black youth suicide? What are some of the reasons? Now, I know when I do trainings, I talk about a number of different issues that may be impacting Black youth in terms of really understanding their reality, because their life experiences are very different from when we grew up. So what they're exposed to, the message that they receive, what they're exposed to in the community, what they see about racial trauma, very different from what we've been exposed to. So there's a number of different issues that may contribute to the increasing rates. And I also want to say that when we talk about suicide, for us to keep in mind that suicide is a very complicated issue. So it's not generally due to one issue, like, oh, somebody got, lost their job, or somebody broke up with somebody else. And no, it's usually a lot of very complicated variables, overlapping variables, situations that we may not have the full picture about. So when we think about suicide in general, Black youth suicide, there are a number of different things that may be happening. But I think the most important thing is what we're talking about is the awareness, understanding the reality of our youth, and anybody who's experiencing suicidal thoughts, also culturally grounded prevention and intervention, which we really don't have that much. So there needs to be more work in the field for that. But I think part of it is this level of fear. And I think some people are kind of superstitious. If I say it, or if I ask my kid, then that's going to make it worse. Can we briefly talk about that? So when I used to work for the school district, I did a lot of crisis response work. And part of what we would do in terms of training the school staff was let them know that part of the protocol is if you have any suspicion of suicidal thoughts, that you directly ask someone. You directly ask them, are you having thoughts of killing yourself? And people would feel very anxious about saying that because they would feel like they're putting the thought in somebody's head. Can you all speak to why it's so important to directly ask someone if we have suspicions of suicidal thoughts?
I think that the myth is that if we ask them, we're going to put that thought into their head. But what I've seen is that when you ask that question directly, you are
Mhm.
actually, they feel relief. It's a bit of
Yes.
relief because it shows that, hey, this person is paying attention to me. They
Yep.
see me, they hear me, and they're a person that it should be safe for me to talk to because they're already open to talking about. If they say the statement of, "Are you thinking of suicide?" or "Are you thinking of killing yourself?" This person's already open to talk to me, so I don't have to
Mhm.
feel like, maybe there's something wrong with me if I feel this way, because a lot of people feel that way. And kind of like the underlying thing that I've seen with the cases. So with my work with the reserve component, I Army Reserve, I looked at every single suicide death case that happened over the past 10 years.
Mm.
A lot, very heavy on me. But one kind of that
Mhm.
underlying thing that I've seen, and it's from the youth, the family members, the soldiers, is a lack of hope and feeling like a burden. And we see that a lot with with our youth. I can
Yeah.
speak to one individual, a mother who lost her 8-year-old son to suicide, and he
Mm.
overheard her conversation with dad saying, "Hey, I need some money. I'm trying to do these things with our child, and I need you to help me out because it's kind of financial burden on me." He
Mhm.
overheard that conversation and he took that as, "Hey, I'm a burden to mom." And he
Yeah.
ended up dying by suicide. So,
Wow.
just even something like is that taught me as mom to having my children, like, okay, I want to make sure if there's anything going on financially, or if I'm struggling, I'm taking it in another room. I'm not going to
Mhm.
let them hear anything that's going on because I don't want them to feel like there's a burden
Mhm.
coming from me, where they, by the choice of suicide, might say, "Hey, I'm gonna make things easier on mom, or I'm gonna make
Yeah.
things easier on dad," or whoever that may be. But a
Yeah.
lack of hope and feeling like a burden is kind of an underlying thing that I've seen consistently.
Yes, yes. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the risk factors and warning signs for suicide, but I do appreciate that you talked about that. So, when we think about discussions about suicide, and as I mentioned before, a lot of the conversations on my channel focus on Black women in toxic jobs. And then when we heard about the heartbreaking news about Dr. Antoinette Bonnie Candia-Bailey, I think that that was heart wrenching. I think it was shocking for a lot of us. And the initial reports that came out said that it was related to workplace bullying. Now, we don't have the full story. As I said before, suicide is a very complex issue, but I think for a lot of us, it terrified us. And I think that many of us have been in a period of collective grief about the loss of our sister. So, can you speak to that collective grief that many of us have experienced following her passing?
I think Dr. Antoinette, her, passing, I think when we talk about collective grief, there's like a shared understanding and a shared experience of what someone has gone through and what has led to them dying, by suicide. So when we think about, Dr. Antoinette, we probably all know a woman like her, someone who is, a high performer who may have accomplishments, but are
Mhm.
still dealing with the complexity of external factors. So what's happening, in the workplace, what's happening with family, what's happening in community, but also, internal factors as well that often go ignored or unsupported. So when I heard, about her story, I just thought about like, I know some Dr. Antoinettes right now, who
Mhm.
are high achievers, who are in positions who are not being treated with kindness, but also are dealing with other mental health related concerns
Mhm.
that aren't, being cared for. So that's like what I really thought about when I heard about her passing. And I also think that it helps to bring awareness to us about what other signs look like. And
Mhm.
Chelsea Christ, who was the Miss USA who died by suicide a couple years
Yeah.
ago, also fits a very similar profile. When you look at her, she has it all, but
Right.
but because there's that perception, you may not check on them. You may miss
Mhm.
signs because of what it may appear like on the outside and not really taking note of what's going on the inside.
Yeah, I think that for many Black women that we have to be high performing because that's how we were brought up, that we have to work twice as hard to get half as much, which is not fair, but it's true. So that's we've already known that. So we work, and then we're masking. So can you all speak to what is the role that extreme stress may have in relation to mental health challenges and suicidal thoughts? What is the role?
Can,
Uh-huh.
I want to jump in. This is probably somewhat related to your question, but I also want to talk about a little bit about Dr. Bonnie, not specifically because, again, we don't know the circumstances, but I would like to share my reaction to her passing. You know, as Camesha said, you know, a lot of us may know people like her. I feel like I'm like her. Right. I could in some ways relate to some of the external things that she was dealing with. And I want to bring up for Black women the very real and present impact of institutional racism, interpersonal racism, and discrimination that the research has shown impacts our mental health and well-being. You know, again, this is not anything specific to her circumstances because, you know, I'm not involved, but, you know, I know as a Black woman and know Black women who have dealt with and been in workplaces where you didn't feel unsupported, where you knew that, you know, I mean, Dr. Kamani, the work that you do, right? All the things that you do and the conversations that you have. And so I remember.
And not being protected too, right?
So
being attacked.
Not being protected.
Yeah.
Not being protected, being dismissed, being questioned. Is it really this? Is it really that? And when you're talking about the fact that suicide does not occur from one single factor, as Camesha was saying, and Kimberly was saying, you know, it's a confounding of a lot of different things coming together at a time where people begin to feel hopelessness, as we talked about, and despair. And so I want to make sure that we call out the impact of racism and racial trauma and its impact on mental health as a stressor for us as Black women. I think it's, you know, not just Black women, Black men, Black youth, right? For Black people, that's one of those unique factors when you're looking at risk factors, those type of experiences. And so that collective grief is really, for me, vicarious trauma.
Yeah, I agree.
That's really what it is when I hear of the passing of, you know, people who look like me, who have some shared experiences that I can relate to. So I wanted to.
I appreciate you adding that element that when we think about our functioning, that we have to look at it within the context of a system of white supremacy, because white supremacy permeates all of our systems. And we think about in the workplace, for us as Black women, that we disproportionately experience workplace bullying and all these other negative things. So we're holding all these things. It's kind of like thinking about rocks in a backpack. So we're putting all these rocks in the backpack and we're kind of worn down. But we keep going, right? We have the mask and we keep going, but it can wear us down. And the part that we heard with Dr. Antoinette is not having the institutional support. And so in some ways, that institutional betrayal to add onto it to the point where someone starts feeling helpless and hopeless. And that kind of is that spiral that could be so dangerous. So I think too, Tandra, and when you mentioned about the impact, I remember exactly where I was when I heard about her passing. And I could not get up. I was like, it felt like somebody had punched me in my stomach. And I just sat there and I felt immense grief. I didn't know her, but like you said, I related to her as another Black woman, another Black woman in a professional environment, I related to her and I felt extreme sadness for her. And I think it was a level of, oh my God, if that could happen to her, that could happen to any of us. And that's the part that I think was very scary for a lot of people who heard about her experience. So as we think about what she went through and we think about the impact of institutional racism, so you said it impacts mental health, and we also know it impacts our physical health. So we know that as Black women, the research is out. American Heart Association is saying that as Black women, we're now dying at earlier ages because of this stress that we're experiencing, the racism and sexism. So we're now dying at earlier ages. So we need to be mindful of ways that all these institutional issues and other issues are impacting us physically and mentally. So ladies, can we talk about what are some of the risk factors? So Kimberly, you already talked about some. Tandra, you talked about some, and Camesha, you talked about some. So can we talk specifically about what are some of the risk factors for suicide? For people watching this, they can be aware of that for themselves as well as for other people.
I think the biggest one is change. So even if whatever the person's norm is, when they get outside of their norm, that's a red flag for me. And a red flag risk factor, that I use those terms interchangeably. But
Yeah.
when you look at like social media posts, I when I teach the class, I say, hey, if you have somebody that's got a selfie every morning, they're like, hey, this is me, and then all of a sudden, maybe 2 mornings go by, 3 mornings go by, and they don't do that morning selfie. That's a change. Well, we may not, it might be a minor thing, but that's a change in their behavior. Even something as it doesn't seem like a normal thing, but like say that grumpy person that you're like, oh my gosh, I just wish they would, find some happiness in their life, and they show up one day and they're happy and they're just like, hey, and they're just the most pleasant person you've ever seen. That while others might look and go, they finally got it. I'm going to look at that and say, what's different? Because this
Yeah.
person's happy. They weren't happy before. They're outside of their norm.
Yeah.
So change is a big one, whatever that could be, so many different examples of that, but change from their normal behavior is a key one that I like to talk about.
Yeah, that's very important. I know that when I used to train on this in the school district too, I would talk about that. So the main issue is that we're looking at changing their baseline behavior. So if we see a kid who's normally very sullen or not very interactive, but then they just seem so jovial all of a sudden and light, that most people would look at that and say, oh, I'm so happy that this kid is doing so much better. But what we don't understand is that the child may actually feel a sense of peace because they made a decision to take their own life. So we might think, oh, something's so much better. But anytime there's a change in their baseline behavior, we need to really pay attention to that and really check in with people. So thank you, Kimberly. What about for you, Camesha and Tandra? What are some of the risk factors for suicide?
So I like to, one of the ways that helps me when I'm explaining to people around warning signs. So some of the things we were talking about relate to, if you see these things immediately, these are some immediate indicators that someone might be in distress. So we've talked about changes. And I would even say if we see changes in talking, what they say, posting, like Kimberly said, so changes in talk. If we see changes in behavior, so they're isolating, they're not going to work, or they're not keeping up with their responsibilities. So changes in talk, changes in behavior, and changes in mood. I think we were talking about like, hey, if they were, usually happy and now they're more sullen. So warning signs are those things that alert you, danger, danger, this person is really struggling. And so it's important for us, those of us who are around people, I like to say we are our sister's keeper, to be watching for those things in our friends, in our family members, in ourselves, and we know sometimes when we struggle, what do? We isolate, we don't talk, those changes occur. And so when we see changes in talk, in mood and behavior, and risk factors are more enduring things. These are those things like when you think of risk factors for heart disease, right? The things that happen and can occur in someone's life that can place them at an increased risk
Mm-hmm.
for a condition, and in this case, suicide.
Mm-hmm.
So one risk factor has to do with health, right? So untreated mental health conditions, undiagnosed, unaddressed mental health conditions can be a risk factor for suicide.
Mm-hmm.
Physical conditions, chronic pain and illnesses, those types of physical conditions that impact and affect us can be a risk factor for suicide. Now, keep in mind, we're not just saying just one risk factor or one thing, but it's a combination of things.
Right.
So
Right.
when we think of health, those are some risk factors that I'll share. There are also some historical factors that I want to make sure that we highlight as well. So if someone has had previous suicide attempts, right, that is a risk factor, or family history of suicide, or abuse, neglect, trauma, generational trauma, racial trauma, those things that we're talking about. So those are some historical factors that can be risk factors for suicide.
Yes.
Camesha has some she wants to add.
I think you all covered most of the ones that I've seen as well, but another one is violence and abuse. I've seen, or we've seen a real uptick at Safia Community Care with the winner in domestic violence relationships. We've also seen an uptick in women who live in communities where there's a high incidence of gun violence. So there can be, for the gun violence, more grief and loss, and experiencing thoughts of suicide around being around so much grief and loss. And then with survivors of domestic violence, intimate partner violence, sexual violence, all the above, there just being a feeling of they can't get out, they can't escape. So what's the point of living? So that's like just one that I wanted to bring up that isn't thought about as much, but I'm definitely seeing.
The environment.
Yeah. Yeah.
And with that, I would be remiss if I did not mention this, but access to lethal means. So having access to guns or drugs or things that are lethal is a risk factor.
Yes.
And all the things that we've been talking about, discrimination, stressful life events. And a lot of people don't think about stressful life events, transitions, divorce, children going off to college, those types of things. So we really have to be thoughtful about when people have changes or they're experiencing financial problems or crises, a loss of a house, an eviction, a loss of a job. So all of these can be risk factors for suicide.
True. So good. I just wanted to add a few more things. So when I think about risk factors, I think about like a stoplight, right? So risk factors are like the yellow light. Watch out, be careful, look out, okay? And then the warning signs we're going to talk about too is like the red, like stop immediately. We need to assess. We need to figure out what's going on with this person and try to get them to safety. So, when you talk about access to weapons, and I think Kimberly, you made a comment about gun violence too. For us to think about guns, I'm not here to talk about, what I think about guns or anything like that. But for us to keep in mind that having a gun in the home is the most significant risk factor for young people. Okay. So when I used to be on the suicide review for LA County, we would have to review cases where youth died by suicide. And almost all of the cases where a youth had died by suicide, it was a gunshot. The parent, when they interviewed the parent said, I had the gun and the bullets separately. I had a combination lock. They were separate, but the kids were able to figure out how to get in there. So us to keep that in mind, the number one risk factor for youth with suicide is having a gun in the home. The other thing is we need to think about, when you talk about access to weapons, it may be not only what's in the home, but what do they have access to? So if they're gang involved, do they have access to weapons? If they are gang involved, do they go into rival gang territory with their colors, which makes them more at risk, right? So that might be not like active, but more passive. And then the whole thing about there may be situations of death by cop where they may engage in behaviors that might make them at risk for some type of police activity. Also, you all mentioned this too, but I want to just elevate this issues of helplessness and hopelessness. So if you hear people say something like, life will be better, I just wish I were dead, things like that, that's very serious, that helplessness and hopelessness, and particularly that issue of feeling like you're a burden, feeling like if I weren't here, life would be so much better. That is very serious if we hear young people talk about that. So there's a whole host of risk factors that we need to be aware of and always be listening, right? So it's not just what we see. So it might be a change in their appearance. It might be a change in their mood, their behavior, but it might be the nonverbal stuff, or it might be their social media posting. It might be a whole host of things that we need to be aware of. So ladies, we've talked a little bit about this, but I want us to talk a bit about looking out for your strong friend. I've heard people say that. Check out for your strong friend. Okay. So what is it that people should be checking for? Right. So we say that, but what does that mean? What are we checking for?
I'll say for me, my strong friends are my military community. They're still here and I'm very active with them. The strong ones that they can never say no. The ones that they say, oh, we know that person will do it because they always do it. And I kind of got to a point myself where I said, you know what, I am my own worst enemy because I don't know how to say no. And once I grabbed a hold of that and said, you know what, it's okay. And I would rehearse different ways to say no. I felt so much better. But the strong friends is just having that conversation to say, hey, I know you told me you're okay, but let's do some real talk. And having that conversation wherever you go, maybe go sit down, have a coffee somewhere, invite them out somewhere. And I like getting out in nature. I just think there's something good about having trees and birds outside. But just say, tell me, let's have some real talk, because
Yeah.
they're so used to putting up that veil and that front that they may not even speak to you, even if you're, that's your sister, your partner, your battle buddy. A lot of times they don't want to share that, but you just have to get in their face and be real with them, because often because they're that strong one, they're not going to do it.
Right. I remember last week we had Rev O on, and she said that sometimes people would ask her, she was grieving, and people would ask her, how you feeling? And so she was like, sometimes people would say, or she would hear other people say when they were grieving, I'm blessed and highly favored. So it was kind of like this kind of automatic response, but it didn't really deal with how they were really feeling. And feeling on some level, if I said that I wasn't feeling okay, then that means that I wasn't thankful, that I'm blessed. So being okay to say that, but I think part of it too is when we have that strong friend, that we say to them what we've noticed. Real talk says, I'm worried. I've noticed this, and this about you, because they may be trying really hard to have this front or this, like everything's okay. But if you see things are not okay, please directly say what you've noticed about them and that you're concerned. And you can even say, if you're not comfortable talking to me about it, my hope is that you have someone else that you can talk to, and or you're in therapy and you're able to talk about these things. Any other thoughts, Camesha and Tandra, about what you can say about the strong friend? So checking on that strong friend, what would you say to her if you have some indication that something's not quite right?
This conversation is just very timely because I have, well, one, I'll say two things. One, when people tell me, how we go and we say, oh, how are you doing? And everybody says good, right? But if
Yeah,
somebody says I'm not good, I think that is something particularly for the strong friends that needs further like investigation, like, oh, what's happened, what's changed, what are you going through? I also think that us asking how we can support them, because the strong friends don't get asked
right.
how they can be supported, because they're supporting everyone else. So recently I had a friend who we hadn't connected in a while, and she told me she was really going through a rough time. And the first thing I said is, how can I support you? She told me exactly what she wanted and how she wanted to be supported, and we're hanging out tomorrow night.
Oh, I love
Very
that.
simple, very
Yeah.
simple, and I don't even know what she's going through, but to just make yourself available to say, hey, I'm here to support you. What can I do? Because strong friends don't often get that opportunity.
Yeah. And I think the other thing too, I think Rev O talked about this too, is to be mindful of not saying, call me if you need anything. Because most people, most strong people are not going to just call you if they're struggling because they feel like they're being a burden. So let us take it upon ourselves to take that initiative to reach out to them and check in with them. How can I support you? And not just wait for them to reach out to you, because again, that's probably not going to happen. Tandra, did you have something else you wanted to add to?
No, I love what Camesha and Kimberly have said. And one of the things I was thinking as they were talking was how sometimes it's important when that strong friend has lots of things going on, and sometimes they're just mentally exhausted, and may not want to go through all the things. And so making yourself as a support person available by you being open about your mental health issues or your struggles, normalizing, I think Kimberly said, or normalizing this conversation that we all have our breaking points, you know, and openly talking about, ooh, last week was a rough week, you know, and I was feeling overwhelmed and I wasn't getting much sleep and I was irritable. And if you did something that helped you, share that with a strong friend. Sometimes sharing your experiences normalizes that conversation. And it might be that you then become someone that that strong friend feels like they can connect with on that level.
Yeah.
Sometimes
You
that's
don't feel like you're alone or like you're the only one.
You don't feel like you're alone because you're hearing your sister, you know, talk about like, "Ooh, this was rough," or "This has been a rough 2 weeks," and
Right.
right, I'm struggling, and this is what I did. And you're doing it for you, but you're also doing it for your friend, and to have these normal conversations about when we're struggling and that we're here for one another.
Yeah. Particularly when people say life be lifing, like lean into that. So what do you mean by that? Like what's going on? Right.
Yeah.
Or how can I support you? Not just like, oh girl, me too. Right. But having more of a conversation. So Kimberly, I just thought about something because you have been in the military. Can you speak a little bit about suicide rates for veterans or those who are still in the military? Because I hear different pieces of information about that.
Yes. So the number that you'll hear often is 22 a day. And that's speaking to the veteran population. That's the ones that have left military service, either through retirement or just, you know, maybe they did their time and they got out. That's 22 a day, but that number is actually extremely low. The 22 that they're capturing are the 22 that were registered in the VA system of healthcare. Many veterans get out. They don't want anything to do with the military and they don't register. So the
Wow.
number 22 a day is much higher. Now, when we look at the reports for soldiers, I won't say soldiers, service members that are still serving, that's Air Force, Navy, Army, Marines, Space Force. The numbers so far this year, as of the month of August, the numbers are trending a little bit higher than they were last year, and we continue to see that. I'll say that the number, I don't look at the numbers so much for the suicide. I look at the number of ideations. So if somebody comes and says, "Hey, I'm struggling with thoughts of suicide and I want you to help me." Those numbers are also going up. So I see that as a positive story because people are feeling comfortable enough to say, "I need help."
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's what we teach them to do. So when we look at the big numbers for the military services, I'm like, that's not a bad thing. We want them
Yeah.
to come forward and get help. But
Yeah.
absolutely, our numbers are increasing. And what we're seeing a lot of times, people associate veteran suicide with combat tours. The majority of the soldiers that die by suicide, or the military service members that die by suicide, have never served a day in combat. They're joining the
Wow.
military with that stress. They're joining the military with trauma. Just think about some of these, the Chicago, the Birmingham that just happened. Those are things that bring stress and trauma on children at a young age. A lot of them join the military looking for a family. looking
Ah,
for that unit to be a part of, and they get in the military and maybe we're not enough to, kind of identify those problems. They come in and they mask it, and
mm,
they ultimately end up dying by suicide. But our numbers are increasing, and that means that we as a society need to do better. We need to get them at that younger age and start talking about mental health care when they're in middle school and elementary school. Like, hey, I'm going to go
absolutely.
get some mental health care. It's a great thing to do. But
Absolutely.
the military is a representation of society. So we
Mm,
definitely need to get in all aspects of it to ensure that we're talking about it and saying, hey, this is okay. It's okay to
yeah.
not feel okay.
Yeah, yeah. So I absolutely agree that we need to talk about it at younger ages. And sometimes people used to say when I used to work for the school district, why are you talking about this with kindergartners or whatever? Because 5-year-olds do have died by suicide. So it is so inconceivable sometimes for people to believe that. But we need to be able to really recognize this is serious. Like we can't just say, oh, they're young, they don't know what they're talking about. They may. And so again, leaning into that. And Tandra, I saw you came off mute, but Kimberly, I want to ask you something right quick to a follow-up question. What is the military doing to address these increasing rates? And is there any are there any barriers to service people reporting experiencing suicidal ideation while they're in the military?
So the military is doing a lot. They've greatly increased their training. We had an antiquated training from 2012. It took all the way up to about 2 years ago to update the training. So we need to teach them in the way that they learn. They
Mhm,
kind of steer away from online or our avatars and that kind of thing. But that's how the majority of the folks joining the military right now, some of them had their whole high school education online due to COVID. So we need to kind of meet them where they are and teach them in the way that they're going to be receptive to the learning. Um, as far as they're doing that to try to help out, but um there's a we rely on the community partners to help, so we can't do it alone. They're
mhm,
doing the best that they can, but there are still a lot of gaps out there, and that's why we rely on nonprofit organizations and different things like that to help
mhm.
out with those suicides that we're seeing. But there's a lot of work to be done, but there's a lot of progress that has happened over the past few years.
Awesome. And are there any negative ramifications when a service person may report experiencing suicidal ideation if they're still in the military?
Yeah, so what we tell them is the answer is not a yes or a no. There it has to be compounded information. So, for instance, if a soldier is say they're going through deep depression, you're not going to be put out of the military because you say, "Hey, I have depression. I need to be put on medication." What the
Mhm,
military will do is say, "Okay, maybe for the next 90 days, we'll put you a flag in the system that says, 'Hey, this person shouldn't hold weapons,' or we're not going to send them to combat or anything like that until their
mhm,
medicine's normalized.
mhm,
Once the medicine's normalized and you're okay, then they'll take that flag down and you're ready to serve." There are many
mhm,
people in the military that are serving that are on medications, that have
mhm,
medical issues that maybe they're not 100%, but they're 80% and they can still serve their country. So we're
mhm,
not going to just put you out because of that. In the past, we had an issue with people that would reach out for care and they would lose their security clearance. If you
oh,
lose your security clearance, you can't go into the Pentagon or different jobs. You can't hold them.
mhm,
What they did is they changed it to say, "Hey, are you seeking mental health care?" And they added to that question to say, if you're seeking it for relationships or for, to help you with some personal trauma, then say
mhm,
no to this question. Now, if it's something else where you're mandated to seek care because you did something and maybe in the criminal courts,
mhm,
you have to say yes to that question. So they've taken it away as just a blanket no because you're seeking care, and understanding that we're encouraging people to seek care, so we don't want to penalize them for doing it.
Ah, that's good information. Thank you, Kimberly. Sandra, you going to say something as well?
I do. I just thank you for sharing that, Kimberly. And when you were talking, I thought of a couple of things that I just want to. We've been using this word elevated, or I've been using elevate for us. A lot of times we have conversations about suicide prevention. We focus on individuals who die by suicide, and that is tragic because we don't want anyone dying by suicide. But suicide prevention is about intervention, right? People
Mhm,
who are struggling with thoughts of suicide that might live daily and they may never attempt, right? So we want to make sure that we have a full picture of all of the impacts of suicide, right? Those people who are having thoughts, those people who may have attempted in the past, but they did not die because of their attempt. We want to also think about the loved ones, right, that care for and love on people who are struggling, including all of those individuals, as well as individuals who have been suicidal in the past and have made it through that period, whether they got help, medication, identified great coping skills, that they have gone through that period of their life. And so I want us to broaden, as we think about suicide prevention, I want us to have all of those groups of people in mind, and not just those who we lose to suicide. I think that's important. And Kimberly talked about that as well. And I also, we talked about warning signs, we talked about risk factors, but we're also have been talking today about protective factors.
Yes.
And it's important for us to highlight that, access to mental health care, like Kimberly was talking about, and having a positive attitude towards mental health is a protective factor. Kimberly was talking about people who are seeking family in the military. Well, a strong protective factor is feeling connected. Feeling connected to a family or a community is an important protective factor. So having a place where you feel you belong and that you're loved and accepted, having good problem solving and coping skills is a protective factor, as well as limiting access to lethal means during times of crisis.
Also, like substance use, right? Because that can decrease your inhibition for following up with things. And we're going to also shift a little bit to talk about warning signs, but I forgot another risk factor is also cutting behavior. So self-harm behaviors. So sometimes people feel like self-harm and suicide are the same thing, but they're different. Self-harm is you're engaging in a maladaptive coping response to numb the pain that you're experiencing, but the intention is not to die. However, those who engage in self-harm behaviors are at increased risk for suicide. So again, if you see someone engaging in self-harm behaviors, you need to make sure they're being assessed for suicide as well. So ladies, can we talk a little bit about warning signs? So we talked about risk factors like the yellow light. Now we're talking about the warning signs like red light, flashing red light, stop immediately and get this person assessed. What are some warning signs?
I'll jump us off because there are quite a few of them, but to piggyback on what you just said around substance abuse. So when you're looking at behaviors, I talked about 3 categories of warning signs: what people say, so their talk, their behavior, what they do, their mood, how they feel. So increased use of substances, or drugs, that can be a warning sign. Withdrawing from activities, isolating from friends and family members, sleeping too much or too little, eating too much or too little, right? Some of those behaviors. Another fairly common one that you'll hear is giving away things of importance or things of value to other people. Sometimes people will even go see people and say goodbye, have conversations that feel like that they're saying goodbye, and feeling exhausted. Those can be some warning signs when you think of behaviors that can indicate that someone is in distress.
Yes. Absolutely. Kimberly, I saw you came off mute.
Yes, to couple with that, what Tandra said in the communication, what I've seen with multiple cases, and even myself with my brother, was a text message. So the text message that comes through, that's very, you kind of get that, and you're like, I wonder what they mean by that one. The things like, hey, I should have told you I loved you more, or I really felt like I could have done better. If you get those text messages that come across and you're really not sure, I say that's kind of an elevated one where you should reach out to them immediately. If you have an opportunity to drive to wherever they are, have that conversation. But I've seen probably about 50% of the cases that I've investigated where they've sent a text message or put it on social media, something like that, kind of like a goodbye, like you were saying, Tandra.
Yeah, absolutely. And also I would say verbal statements like directly, I want to die, or kind of like passive, like the world will be so much better, or everybody will be better off if I'm not here. Also postings, like you said, like on social media. That's how we find out a lot about kids, because they'll post something on social media and then somebody else will report, hey, so-and-so reports something on social media. Also, if they're researching about people who've recently died by suicide. So if they're researching about the death, if they're researching any means about how you would go about doing that, unfortunately, they can find so many things on social media or Google. So you need to be mindful of that and recognize that a lot of times young people view people on social media that they're following as their friend. Like they really feel like they're connected to this person. So if this person is struggling in some kind of way, we might see that. And also the issue of contagion. So if a child or someone has died by suicide, and that's why a lot of times it's been a push in the media to not talk about how the person died by suicide, because there's the issue of contagion where you see people will engage in a similar behavior because they've heard about what somebody else has done. And then the other thing is trying to access weapons or trying to access medication, trying to access those things we need to be aware of. So, ladies, I know it's been a very heavy conversation, but so needed. What would you say to someone who's experiencing suicidal thoughts? What can they do if they're experiencing suicidal thoughts?
I think the first thing I would just tell them is you got to have that connection with them, give them a feeling that they do belong and that they do matter, and
Mm-hmm.
letting them know that, hey, it's okay that you feel this way, and there's many resources out there to help them. I think it's very bold, and a lot of people are afraid to even admit that they have those feelings. But just having a conversation with them to say, hey, listen, let's sit down and call 988. There are people on the other line that we can talk to, and I'll do this with you. Don't give them a number without giving them sitting down with them to do that.
Mm-hmm.
But the key thing is being present with them and letting them know that, hey, we can work through this together. And then you have to put in that commit, and that's a good way to say commit. We need to be there with them to make those phone calls, to take them wherever there's needed. But it's going to be an investment of time to help them through that process. And if you're not the person to do it, then maybe connect them with the person that is.
Yeah, yeah. So if you are aware of that, those are things you can do. But if it's just you yourself, then also know that you can do those things that we've talked about and that are on the screen too, right? So you can go to the nearest emergency room. You can call 911, let them know it's a mental health emergency. You can contact 988. So, Camesha and Tandra, any other thoughts about what you would advise someone to do if they're experiencing suicidal thoughts?
So one thing that, I mean, calling the hotline and all those things I think are important. One, I think it's important to reach out to someone who you trust, and someone who cares about you. That can be a major source of support for people who are experiencing thoughts of suicide. And there are people, unfortunately, who feel like they don't have anybody, like there's not someone they can reach out to. But when I've done safety plans with clients or my team, most people can identify at least one person that they can reach out to share what they're experiencing and to receive support. And so that is one thing that I highly encourage people to do, is to reach out to someone who cares. Also, one thing that we have found, especially for people who've experienced isolation, this is, I guess, kind of a coping skill, but could also be helpful, is to be in a space where there's other people. So even if you're going to a coffee shop or a public place, but just sometimes being around other people can kind of pull you out of the space of isolation that you've been in. And so that's something else that can sometimes get overlooked, but can also be helpful if someone's having thoughts.
Yeah, those are really good points. What about for you, Tandra?
I was just going to say that we all have a responsibility for suicide prevention. So we need to know what to do and what to say when someone is struggling and they reach out to us. So we all need to know, you know, it's important for us to be able to have that conversation, and to be honest and compassionate, listen to what they have to say is very important. This is not your time to tell them what they need to do with their life and why their life is all messed up. That is not the time to do that.
Or they're gonna go to hell if they do it, right?
That's a whole other that's a whole other conversation. But when someone comes to you, you gotta be prepared. You gotta know that if it's your first time somebody sharing that with you, it's going to be uncomfortable. It's going to be scary. Imagine what they're feeling, right? Just imagine what they're feeling. And so it's okay for you to say, wow, I didn't realize that you were going through what you're going through. Can you tell me more about it?
Yeah.
When did you start to have these thoughts? Have you talked to anyone about what you're going through? Have you reached out? Have you gotten help before? This is what I can do for you. And I love the recommendation Kimberly gave about the referral process, right? Going with someone, calling with someone, right? If at all possible, going to have that face-to-face conversation. But we all need to have 988. We need to know that number, and maybe we reach out on behalf of someone, but we have to be prepared to give life-saving conversation and resources to people who are struggling.
So true. And I want to say this specifically to people who might feel like they're snitching on someone if they, if someone tells them they're having thoughts of suicide and we don't do anything about it. Think about this. Would you prefer for that person to be angry with you later? Or would you prefer for that person to still be here, right? So we might have, they said I shouldn't say anything, or they said I'll be okay. But if you have that worry, if you have any suspicion, we need to take immediate action, okay? So we have to put all the other stuff, aside in terms of, well, I don't want to be a snitch, or they said I'm okay. But if they're really not okay, then we really need to follow up on that. So ladies, I've also heard about this. People have said that they've contacted someone to come take their gun, right? So if they had a gun in the home, they've contacted someone to take their gun, or if they've had pills in the home, they've asked somebody to take the pills because it was just too much of they had too much access. So they said, I need for you to just take this away from me because I might get impulsive and respond in a certain way. So what about, and Kimberly, this is more so for us in terms of losing someone who's we've lost someone who's died by suicide. Can you speak in terms of the supports available? As I said before, when it happened to me when I was 17 with my dad, there weren't resources available, and there was so much shame about what happened. The way that people responded was so it added even more to the devastation. So people would no longer say my father's name. They would kind of act like he never really existed. It was kind of like this big kind of secret that nobody talked about. And as a 17-year-old, having to kind of hold on to that was just very challenging. And I think that's why I'm so I can say committed with this, right? So I'm so committed to really talking about this issue because I don't want other people who have lost someone to suicide to feel the same level of shame that I felt for so many years. Like, it's only been very recently that I've even talked about this publicly. Like, a very few people in my personal life even knew what happened, but the fact that I'm talking about it publicly is that I really want people to feel like they're not alone if this has happened to them. But can you talk a little bit more about resources? I know that certain organizations or certain communities have like support groups for survivors. Can you speak a little bit more about resources for survivors of those if we've lost somebody to suicide?
Yes, yes. So one common bond is the nonprofit that I run. I founded it based off of everything I experienced, very similar to what you did. I shared that my mother and father were both ministers, and when my brother died by suicide, no one reached out to my family. I
Wow.
was livid. It took me a good 3 months to kind of just let that settle. And my book, I said, okay, that's unacceptable. let me build something that is acceptable, and let me be that
Yeah.
person. If anybody wants to, be out there to reach out for folks after a loss, I want to be that person. So
Mhm.
what One Common Bond does is we kind of started with suicide grief, but I understand the reason for One Common Bond, the name is that grief, we are all gonna experience grief at one point in our lives. Let's do this
Mhm.
together to make sure that we get through it in a healthy way. So One Common Bond provides grief care packages to people after a
Is it
suicide.
called One Common Bond?
Yes, the number, it's ONE, common,
Okay.
bond.org. And we have been doing this actually since 2017 is when I've been really strong doing it for all grief. But we started after that because it was unacceptable to me, and I didn't want anybody to go through that. So part of what we send on our grief care packages are books on suicide prevention. I'm
Mhm.
sorry, not on suicide loss, because that loss is very different from a car accident or cancer.
Mhm.
We
Mhm.
also provide journals, and if there's anything we know specific about that family, we put it in there. If you're faith-based, we're going to put some really good literature on scriptures and things to help you with that. If you're not faith-based, we're going to put other things that might just encourage you. But we send that to people all over the world. We've sent them, I mean, literally all over the world. So we don't
Wow.
want you to be in a position where you say, okay, I don't know what to do through this grief, but we're the ones that are going to help you out with that. We also, understanding that there's so many aspects of it, on One Common Bond's webpage, you can go on there and there's a free suicide prevention training. So everything we talked today, it's kind of hard to digest. We're taking little bits and pieces of it, but
Mhm.
everything and all the definitions that we talked about are in an online training on that same website. If you go to onecommonbond.org, and that's the number one,
Oh, the number one.
commonbond.org.
Sorry.
Yes, the
Let me
number one,
change that.
commonbond.org. That way, you can go back and get a refresher. Or if say maybe 2 weeks from now, you're talking to somebody and you're like, oh shoot, this kind of seems like I need to respond to this in a certain way. Go on that website and learn how to do that. But please push them my way. What I've done is I've made a commitment to send these out free of charge. So if somebody has a loss, I don't want money to be a factor to say, hey, I don't know what to do. Call Kim. I'll get the packages sent out to them. I'm
Wow.
in my office right now. I have a whole table full of them, um, of grief packages to send out, because I don't want you to go through that, to have the same experience that I had, where you don't have anyone to reach out to and you just don't know what to do. But definitely, you're not going alone when it comes to suicide, especially in the Black
Mhm.
community. You're not
Yeah.
in this by yourself. People don't really talk about it. They waited about a couple years after we lost my brother to come forward and say, "Hey, I lost my uncle, or I lost my relative," but nobody wanted to say it to us in the moment when we really, really needed that support. So
Yeah.
that's been our goal. That's my mission in life, from here until death do do me part. I'm going to be here to stand up and say, "Hey, I'm here to talk about suicide. I'm here to help you if you've had a loss, and hopefully to motivate you so that you don't get to that point by doing my resilience training."
Wow, that's powerful. So everyone, I put information for Kimberly's organization on the screen. It will also be in the description section, so please check her out. So we've talked about onecommonbond.org, provides information, resources. Camesha and Tandra, can you talk about other resources that might be available to people to learn more about suicide prevention and other supports?
So one organization that I really love is Hope for the Day. They're an organization based in Chicago, but what they do is provide suicide prevention training and how to provide like peer support and to have some of those tougher conversations that people want to avoid when it comes to suicide prevention and intervention. So, excellent. Like they're a really, really great resource. Of course, the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention as well is a great resource. And then also, if you want training to support people in crisis, mental health first aid is a great one. A lot of people don't know that a part of mental health first aid is being able to respond to suicidal thoughts and also self-harm. So those are just, some other resources that I think are helpful. And as Tandra, as you shared earlier, like it takes all of us to know how to have these conversations, how to support people, because it can be anybody that we
Mhm.
come into contact with.
So true. Thank you, Camesha. What about for you, Tandra?
Well, I would like to also highlight the work that Sister Afia is doing. And I've been sitting here thinking about the Heal Her Together, the peer support. And I would like for Camesha to talk a little bit more about that. And there are some other resources on the website that could be helpful. But I think, the peer support piece is very important, because there is no way, I know we've mentioned a couple times, like, talking to someone and getting therapy, but wellness care looks very different. There is a continuum of wellness care. It's not just talk therapy, and there are not enough therapists to meet the needs of everyone who needs, who might want one or need one. So I think that this is an opportunity for us to just talk a little bit about peer support and the role that it plays, as well as other types of supports that promote mental wellness.
Excellent. Excellent. And then, Tandra, don't you do trainings in churches?
I come back to that.
Okay.
And did
I spell, is it Sister STI?
I'll put it in the private chat so you can
awesome.
see.
Okay.
Yep. So you can get the website.
Okay. So I'll put information. Okay. Excellent. So ladies, as we are winding down before we get to the chat, can you please share about your current work and how you can be contacted?
Yeah, sure. So I'll start. So what Tandra was sharing is that Sister Afia Community Care has a peer support program for Black women called Heal Together. It is based in the Chicago and surrounding suburbs, but these are Black women who are trained to provide one-on-one emotional support, and also to really have someone you can talk to that is non-judgmental, that has a problem solving, but also a supportive orientation. So our peer supporters are not therapists. They're just people who have a heart for mental health, and they go through training about Black women's mental health and also peer support, because a lot of times people don't want to go to therapy, but they just need somebody they can talk to. So Heal Together provides opportunities for Black women to have free one-on-one peer support. And we rolled it out earlier this year, and we're in full swing right now. So if you're someone, or if you know of someone who may be having thoughts about suicide, or if they just need connection, they just need somebody to talk to, Heal Together could be a great opportunity for them.
Camesha, did you say it was free?
Yes, it's free.
Wow. Now that is amazing. Okay. So that's a free resource available to Black women?
Yes, to Black women.
Area.
Yep, in the Chicago, that's our only restriction is Chicago and the surrounding suburbs, but our goal is to be able to expand and train other people in the model in other areas outside of the Chicago area in the future.
That is amazing. Awesome. Okay, thank you. What about for you, Kimberly? Can you tell us a little bit more about, you told me about One Common Bond. I have it back up here on the screen. Is there any additional information you want to share about One Common Bond or any of the work that you do?
So we do have a series of trainings. I mentioned the online training because that's easily accessible to anyone. Very similar to your other panelists there. We do other training. We actually have a course that we just started a model with. We work with the EMS here in Fayetteville, North Carolina, because they're the first responders when it comes to any types of loss and death in the community. So between us, the EMS, and then the church community, we have developed a team where we go in and we train the churches on how to better help when it comes to suicide prevention, and just kind of sharing what we've seen in the cases within our Cumberland County here. So that's something that we've done a couple of pilots of, and we're kind of massaging it as we go along to make sure that it works well and the time is right. But that's where our role is right now, is to get into the church community and the faith-based community, and wherever we go. So my most interesting group of folks I've recently been connected with is Harley Davidson. I do not ride a bike. That ain't me. but,
Wow.
but I tell you what, when I'm in that room, when I was out there at the Harley Davidson last weekend with all those motorcycles rearing, and here I am, and I was like, I don't have the beard, I don't have any of the stuff, but we connected like we had been together for years. We are like-minded, so it's just about connecting with like-minded people, whatever they may look like,
Yeah,
and so that we can be a better support to all the community. But One
yeah,
Common Bond is definitely in the vein of training people and equipping them if they have a loss.
yeah. So meet the people. So go
Yeah,
out to the community and meet the people.
get out there.
And also recognizing that we may look like we don't have similarities, but so many times we do have commonalities
Mhm.
but if you're speaking the language that people need to hear and that you're there to help them, that's really what shines through. And I love what you're doing in the churches. And when I think about the work that you and Tandra are doing in the churches are often the first line of healing for many people in the Black community. So having that connection is so powerful. So thank you, Kimberly. What about for you, Tandra?
So I love this, that all of our work is meeting people where they are. And as you
Mhm.
mentioned, the faith community, the church, the Black church has an important role for many Black people, and not just those people who are within the church, but
Mhm.
people who are outside of the church as well, in
Mhm.
terms of outreach and the work that many faith communities do. And so I provide workshops through Soul Shop. I believe the website is soulshopmovement.org. And they are. I didn't understand that. So soulshopmovement.org.
Okay.
And what's unique about soulshopmovement.org is that it is a workshop, but it is ministry. There isn't anything like it, because Soul Shop takes the approach of equipping faith leaders with the tools and resources that they need to minister to. So when you think about all the aspects of a faith community, from preaching to teaching to prayer to
Mhm.
outreach to equipping the saints, all of those areas in the life of a faith community, this workshop equips faith leaders to meet those needs of individuals. And so we doing that, we use the Bible and we use God's word, and we point out and show, right, through the Bible,
Mhm.
and throughout the day, it's very interactive, where the Bible talks about suicide and desperation and the response, right? The biblical response to that need. And we offer those faith leaders scriptures that they can preach and teach. We invite them to take another look at what they've been teaching and what they've been preaching, to incorporate that into the life of the church. So it's not one-off training that we're going to have on Suicide Prevention Month. What we are really trying to transform ministry,
Mm.
right?
Right.
From the pulpit to the door, right? And
Mm.
so we offer training for Black churches, Soul Shop for Black churches, Soul Shop for leaders, Soul Shop for youth, because we want to meet people where they are. And we see, in faith communities across the country, and these trainings are actually, I'll say across the country, but across the world, right? We have some trainings that have happened in other locations, in Africa and other places, other countries. So this is a movement that we're committed to equipping our faith communities so that they can be able to minister to individuals in their congregations.
This is really uplifting for me, just to see what all of us are doing to really help with suicide prevention. And as we said before, this conversation is during Suicide Prevention Month, but the hope is that we all realize that suicide prevention is a daily thing, right? It's not just during September, but that we all have a role in really addressing this issue. So before we finish, I want to read the chat, and then we're going to wind down for today. So I see greetings. Hello, Marissa. Hi, important conversation. Person is not there. Disease, interesting. Expected to be strong. Hello, everyone. Thank you for bringing this important conversation to this space. Thank you, Dr. Kamani, for hosting this conversation. Thank you for watching. I had a church member tell me I should have prayed more to prevent my wife's cancer death. That's heartbreaking. Use all the tools available. My challenge: dad and 4 siblings all diagnosed bipolar, not me. Yes, we need to reach young people with suicide prevention care. Our doctors are sent by God. Oh, here's a question, Kimberly. What's a better word than triggering? I feel emotionally shot often when dealing with bipolar siblings. So, what would be a better word instead of triggering?
So and that's specifically to, like, if we're putting out a post that, hey, we're going to have just content warning, not just take triggering off and just say content warning. It's
Got
okay
it.
to just say just by itself.
Got it. Okay. And I'm going to change that in my description section. So thank you. Thank you for telling me, Kimberly. How would you respond to a person or congregation that is living in denial of seeking support for trauma because the pastor has not given them permission? Good question. Turn it over to you guys.
That, I think that's another show. I'm not trying to make light of it.
No,
I
no,
really
no.
am not, because that there's context we don't have.
Okay. So,
You know, right? It sounds like, yeah, there's context that we don't have.
yeah. So actually, this is Rev O, who was my guest last week, and I'm going to connect you guys to her. So we could talk about maybe having a follow-up panel, including Rev O and you guys talking about this issue in a more in-depth discussion about it, right? Okay, so thank you. And Rev O, I'm going to be connecting you guys via email, okay? Thank you for the work you do in the faith community, prayer and therapy. White communities have the healthcare benefits. Most of young Black men don't have the support. So true. Glad you are bringing awareness to this. Let's keep the conversation going. Yes, agreed. Social media is a huge factor in youth anxiety and depression. There's also a lack of care for Black students in the U.S. school systems overall. Well, yeah, that could be another panel too. Okay, so we're going to park that one and revisit that too. Good evening, ladies. Thank you for this topic. Hi, ladies. Thank you so much for holding space for this conversation. Why is the changing in behavior might be a form of bipolar disorder? Well, that's the part in terms of we're looking at not someone who has like bipolar disorder. We're looking more so in that change in baseline functioning, right? So bipolar disorder is after like a pattern of behaviors that we'll see for someone. What we're talking about is that change in that baseline, right? So that person who was usually outgoing, now they're no longer outgoing, or maybe they used to be very quiet. Now they're like super over the top. So again, we're looking at the change in baseline behavior. Bipolar disorder is like a pattern of behaviors over time. Okay. Did anybody else want to add to that? No. Okay. Thanks for the program tonight, but it's triggering me, so I'm out. Okay. Thank you for taking care of yourself. It's very important. I heard that for one suicide, there's a higher rate of attempts. Any comments on that? So that generally there's been a number of attempts before they actually died by suicide, right? I think that's the person saying.
Yeah. So that's why it's important. We talked about during the program that if people have a history of attempts, and we need to take those things seriously and address them.
Yeah.
So if someone has attempted and they've gotten intervention and they've gotten support, that's great. We need to make sure that they continue to get the support that they need.
Yeah, agreed. Sometimes the one who is always supporting never gets support, right? And that's why what we're saying is when you see that person, that you reach out to that person. And if you notice that change in baseline behavior, check in with them. And as Camesha said, ask them, how can I support you? Which trickle down. Yes.
And I want to say, and if you are that person, then make sure that you find ways to get support, that you need to take care of yourself. And how do you, and that's a process of making sure that you're okay. So getting support and identifying what you need.
Yeah. And there's a follow-up comment. So there's usually a number of attempts before someone actually dies by suicide. And there's usually a lot of suicidal ideation connected to those thoughts. Yes, so true. Yes, because my ideation started in elementary. I'm so sorry to hear that. And I hope that you are getting support or that you have gotten support if that's an ongoing issue. I believe sometimes the signs of suicide hide in plain sight. A person can appear to be perfectly fine, almost carrying on constantly with no fluctuation in their emotions. Yeah. And that's what's so concerning. And that's the other part what we're talking about if you recognize that within yourself. So there's things that people outside can try to do if they notice a change in baseline, but we also have to recognize for within ourselves when we're struggling and get that support, because if you're masking that well and you're not really showing that change in baseline, people might miss that something's going on with you. That's so true. What would you say to someone who might not reach out because they think that no one can help? Good question. What would you guys say?
One of the things that I want to be careful, the word I use, that concerns me about the work that we do in suicide prevention is that we put a lot of times we put the responsibility on the person who's struggling. We don't do that with any other kind of issue, right? But it's with mental health. And so my thing is that yes, individuals struggle, and as an individual, I am responsible for making sure that I'm okay and I take care of myself and I reach out when I need help. Yes. All those things are true. Additionally, I think it is equally as important and true that if I am part of a community, a family, a friend group, a church group, that I am watching for people in my community who might be struggling, and that I reach out and I'm doing check-ins with people that I know. And I'm connected enough. Most people are connected enough to about 17 to 20 people. And if all of us who are connected to 17 to 20 people look out for those 17 to 20 people, and we agree to look out for one another, I think we will be able to intervene and support people sooner than
That's a
later.
good point. Yeah, like a both and approach.
Yes, it's a both and. We as a community, as however you define that, have a responsibility to, Camesha gave the example of what support do you need, or what do you need? How can I support you? Right. And recognizing that. And so we also should be reaching out, because a lot of times people who are struggling, they isolate, and their thoughts get the best of them, the stigma, nobody's available to help me. And you might be the person that is able to restore their faith, or to let them see that they are cared for, that they are loved. If you reach out in a compassionate way, in a non-judgmental way, that you're ready to listen, not to fix, not to judge, and to make sure that you give them resources if they need additional support.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that. Oh, this is an interesting question too. Does anyone have anything to share about suicidality during pregnancy?
Yeah, this is one where there's an organization called Friends of Zane Adams. It's FOZA.org. Everything that their whole mission revolves around this same question, as well as postpartum depression and suicide. It's founded by a lady who lost her daughter to suicide after giving birth to her son. They
Wow.
have multiple resources, as well as they do a podcast monthly on their website. So FOZA, Friends of Zane Adams, would be the resource I would refer to someone to that had that question.
Okay, I'm going to put that in the chat. Thank you, Kimberly. I was not aware of that. Let me just put that in the chat right now.
And I would also say looking for a therapist that specializes in maternal mental health, postpartum depression, transitions related to motherhood, because I don't know if it's more than it's ever happened before, but there are higher incidences of postpartum depression postpartum anxiety, postpartum trauma. Even if we think about what's happening with mortality, maternal mortality with Black women. So I think people aren't paying a lot of attention to mothers, but they are really, really vulnerable right now after having a child. So I think being able to connect someone to a maternal mental health therapist that specializes in postpartum depression can be a really good starting place.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kimberly. I'm going to add that to the description section too. So it's on the screen, but I'm going to add it to the description section because I didn't even know about that. So that's very helpful. Okay, so I see some comments about the church, right? So we are working. We've got a lot of people working in the church trying to make things better. That nonprofit is a blessing to many, I am sure. What a beautiful way to turn pain into power. So Kimberly, they were talking about your nonprofit. Okay, so let me see. I love what these nonprofits companies are offering. It's so good to know these resources exist. Life-saving. I agree. So the hope is that this conversation, again, about suicide prevention was able to raise awareness about a number of very serious issues, but also to talk about resources that are available to you. You are not alone if you're having these feelings. We've had information about what to do if you're having suicidal thoughts and if you know of someone experiencing suicidal thoughts. We also want you to keep in mind and elevate the protective factors that we all have: community, checking in with one another, mental health treatment, and accessing resources. So everyone, thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much to my panelists. I'm so happy to hear about the amazing work that each of you are doing. And collectively, I feel like we are really going to help so many people. So thank you so much. And for everyone, as you're watching this, if you haven't already subscribed to my channel, please do so. Turn the notification bell so you know when I go live again. And please share this video with at least two other people and give this video a thumbs up. Okay. So panelists, if you guys can stay on, and everyone, I will see you later. Take care. Bye-bye.